What is the world's hardest language? Honestly, I have no idea, but neither does anyone else. If anyone tells you they have the definitive answer to that question, they're either lying, or, more charitably, they might just be a bit too confident in their own opinions. You know how it goes. Every now and then, when there's a trough in the news cycle, you'll see articles about it in the press. Usually it goes something like this. We ask some school or some educational institution how long it takes their students to learn the languages they teach. The one that takes the longest time to learn is the hardest one. And then they switch gears and say, here's a bunch of stuff in the language that makes it hard to learn. The answers they come up with are almost certainly wrong, if only because the schools they're talking to only teach maybe a few dozen languages out of the 5,000 to 8,000 languages currently spoken in the world. But even if the answer is wrong, their intuitions about how to get to that answer, those are actually pretty solid, measuring the amount of time and measuring the amount of stuff in the language. It makes sense to feel like those two things are connected somehow, right? Like, the hardest language is the one that takes the longest time to learn, and the reason it takes so long because of just how much stuff there is to learn. We'll call those two things difficulty and complexity. Imagine a language as a piece of software, and you have to write the code for it. The length of that computer code is the language's complexity. The longer the code is, the more complex the language is going to be. The language's difficulty is what it costs your computer to process that code, either in terms of energy or in terms of time. The more energy or time it takes to process the code, the more difficult the language. Our intuition, well, mine anyway, is that the more complex something is, the more difficult it's going to be. And that's often true, but not always. In the long-form version of this video, which should hopefully be out sometime next month, we'll look at why that is in a lot more detail. But for now, we're just going to focus on the main reason, and that is this. Complexity is objective, but difficulty is subjective. Not in the sense that it's a matter of opinion, but in the sense that it depends on who the user is and what they're trying to do. The length of the computer code stays the same, but the time and energy it takes to process that code might change depending on what you're trying to do with it. To use Walter Küster's analogy, imagine you have two forests. Forest 1 has a single type of tree, and they're all lined up in neat rows, equally spaced out from one another. Forest 2 has a bunch of different types of trees of all shapes and sizes, and the way they're laid out is pretty chaotic. If you wanted to write the code to generate those forests, the code for Forest 1 would be a lot shorter than the code for Forest 2. Forest 1 is less complex than Forest 2. But when it comes to difficulty, then it really depends on who you are and what you're trying to do. If you're an industrial logger, Forest 1 might be the easiest one of the two. It has no unnecessary variables for you to deal with, just the kind of tree you want, laid out in a way that makes it easy to cut them down. But if you're a squirrel trying to survive, reproduce, and do whatever it is squirrels do, then Forest 2 might be the easier one. It'll have a wider variety of foods to choose from, more places to hide from predators, and so on. It's in that sense that difficulty is subjective. It depends on the role of the user. What's interesting with language is that we can take on a variety of roles and switch back and forth between them. Say you're talking with a friend about that squirrel you just saw in the forest. Throughout the conversation, you'll switch back and forth between being the speaker and being the listener. One of you says, speaking of the squirrel, it likes to eat nuts. Why do we add that S at the end of the verb? It likes. Well, that S conveys a piece of information. It tells us that the subject of the verb is third person singular. But that same piece of information is already contained in the pronoun it. By adding an S at the end of the verb, we're just repeating information that's already there. Strictly speaking, we don't need to have it twice. For example, if I say I like or you like, there's no difference in the verb. The information first person singular or second person singular is conveyed only once in the pronoun, and that's enough. But for some reason, when it's third person singular, we reduplicate that piece of information by adding an extra S at the end of the verb. Languages have all sorts of redundancies like that. If you're the speaker, those redundancies make the language more difficult. It's more costly for you because you have to produce the same piece of information multiple times. But if you're the listener, those redundancies just might make the language easier. Say your friend says it likes to eat nuts, and right when he says it, a nearby logger sneezes real loud. You don't hear it, but you do hear the S at the end of likes. When you're the listener, that redundancy gives you an extra anchor point to latch onto if ever you missed the information the first time around. In that way, the same feature of a language might make things harder when you're the speaker, but easier when you're the listener. You could very well imagine that a language is harder to speak than another, but easier to understand. You might still find that one language is harder than the other overall, but if we break it down into different roles like that, we get a picture that is a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than what we're accustomed to. But at this point, you might be thinking, wait a minute, that's not what I mean by a hard language though. What I want to know is, what is the hardest language to learn? Fair enough. In that case, what we want to look at isn't the time it takes to process the code once it's already installed. What we want to look at is how much time it takes to install the software in the first place. And here there are two scenarios to consider. In the first scenario, you take a bunch of new computers with nothing on them yet. You install a different language on each one, and whichever one takes the longest to install, that's the hardest language to learn. This is the realm of first language acquisition. When we're born, we all start at the same place. We might have some hardware that supports language in general, but none of us have the software yet for any specific language. That we get from interacting with our environment. So in theory, you just have to show that one language takes longer than any other for children to acquire as their mother tongue, and that language would be the hardest one in the world. In theory, sure. In practice, it's not so easy. The first problem is also the most mundane: data scarcity. Do we have all the data we need to measure that kind of thing for every language spoken in the world today? No, not even close. So for that reason alone, at this point in time, we just can't say which is the hardest language in the world. But even if we did have that data, there'd be a whole host of other problems to sort out. For starters, there's a rich diversity of human cultures out there. The way we raise our children varies a lot from culture to culture. Because of that, even if you find that one language takes longer to learn than another, you can't automatically conclude that it's because of the language. And even if you manage to filter out all of those cultural factors, you're still left with a bunch of questions about how to actually compare languages. Essentially, you have to work along two different dimensions that interact in various ways. Horizontally, you can compare some features or milestones directly between languages, like when do children say their first word? When do they say their first multi-word segment? How many words do they know at 18 months? And so on. But obviously this only works if the feature is shared by all the languages you're comparing, and very often they're not. You can ask, when do children learn the subjunctive? And that's useful if you want to compare Portuguese and Spanish, but not so much if you want to compare Portuguese and Vietnamese, which doesn't have a subjunctive. On the vertical dimension, you're comparing the language of children who are still learning to some kind of benchmark that's supposed to represent the final state of learning. Something like adult native speech. But where exactly do you set that benchmark? And does that benchmark work across all of the different languages and cultures out there? All of those things combined make it difficult to draw comparisons across languages. There's a very real sense in which each language is its own ecosystem that can't really be compared to others. The second scenario is to take a computer that already has a language installed and see how much time it takes to install a new one. This is the realm of second language acquisition. For a lot of people, this is going to be more familiar territory. It's where you hear people say things like, how hard a language is to learn depends on how similar it is to your native language. And that makes sense, right? If the new software you're trying to install can somehow leverage or reuse parts of the software that's already there, then the installation might go faster. This is what is sometimes called linguistic distance. A language that is similar to the one you already know will be easier to learn than a language that is a lot different. Overall, that seems to hold up. If you're a native English speaker, it'll probably take you less time to learn, say, Spanish than Arabic. So linguistic distance is almost certainly a factor, but that doesn't mean it's the only one. You could very well imagine that linguistic distance also interacts with other factors, like the language's complexity. It doesn't have to be either or. The issues with measuring difficulty in this scenario are very similar to the ones we mentioned for learning your native language. but I'll add just one to finish on. Linguistic distance is meant to be an objective metric. If you drew a typological map of all the world's languages, it would look like a physical map. The distance between 2 points of the map doesn't change, and it's the same in both directions. But instead of a typological map, you could draw a psychotypological map. Psychotypology is a term that was coined by Eric Kellerman in the 1970s. The idea is to measure not the actual distance between languages, but the distance between languages as perceived by the learner. And that perceived distance can be shaped by a number of factors, from broader social and cultural factors all the way down to individual motivations and beliefs. On a psychotypological map, you could get asymmetric distances. For example, you could imagine that because of broader social factors, maybe the distance from French to Japanese is shorter than the difference from Japanese to French, or the other way around. Or you could imagine that because of individual beliefs, the distance from French to Japanese is longer for one French speaker than it is for another French speaker. In a way, it's just a modern twist on the age-old idea that things are hard not because they're actually hard, but because we believe them to be so. And if there's any truth to that, even just a little, then at least if you're learning a language, what is the world's hardest language just might be a question you're better off leaving unanswered.